Okay, all yours, James.
All righty. Well, thank you all for joining us, and I apologize for the delay here. So today, this will be an overview of all the different ways that we match and select an element to filing. So we're going over all of our CSS selectors. What we're going to do is we're going to try to demonstrate all the different ways that we can target elements for styling. We're going to see how CSS selectors can be used in very powerful ways. Make it powerful for us to do some really cool things that are normally done in JavaScript. For example, toggling a modal as Aga's demonstrated a few weeks ago, and also things like displaying tooltips on hover. These types of interactivity are all made possible by the power of CSS selectors. But we're going to start on the lower end of things, and then we'll work our way up from there. Okay. So what is a CSS selector? CSS selector is what we use not to only target elements that we define inside of our markup, but also we can interact with our elements based on their state using CSS selectors, like their hover state, their checked state, their focus state, etc., as well as an element's history. For example, a link. I'm sure we've seen many times where we have visited a link, we come back to that location again, and we see that the color of that link has changed. That's all being done by CSS selectors that have been specified to target that element based on its current properties. So when writing CSS, you write CSS in rules. If you look at the example here, CSS rule is made up of two parts. It's made up of a selector. It's also made up of a declaration block. The selector is a part of the CSS rule that determines which element or elements to apply the styles to that we define, and we define our styles here inside of our declaration block. Okay, so it's pretty simple. We're going to focus more so on the selectors today. We're not going to focus too much on the declaration blocks and the styling. So,
James,
yes, sir.
Could you press the present button so we see the full screen? So it's on the top left there. Then okay. You can press escape to go out.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Okay. Now some of the most common selectors that we use to target elements for styling are these. First off, we have the universal selector. This is pretty much the asterisk. Sorry. The asterisk is used to match pretty much any element of any type within its particular scope. So if we chose to target, let's say we put out an asterisk and we applied some styles, the asterisk alone, it would apply to just about everything inside of our entire DOM. And we'll demonstrate that shortly. We also have type selectors. These selectors are used to match an element by the element's tag name. So if we wanted to style a div, we could match that element by just using the tag name of div or span or h1, any element that we have in our HTML or XML. We also have class selectors. This allows us to select an element based on the class name that we've given it. And class selectors are defined with a period in the beginning, followed by the class name, and then we have ID selectors. ID selectors are defined starting with the pound symbol. After the pound symbol, we follow that with the name of the ID that we've given the element. Okay. Now we can demonstrate some of that here. So, for example, the universal selector. We wanted to apply a style here to our universal selector. Let's say we gave it a color of red. We're going to see here in our presentation that pretty much styles everything red. There might be some issues with specificity and stuff like that here and there, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. But for the most part, in this context, this universal selector is going to select everything. One of the most common uses for the universal selector is for like CSS resets. Typically, if we want to reset the CSS on a particular page, this is one of the most common uses for it. Typically use it for box sizing and things of that nature. But that's the universal selector. We also
James,
have
one question. Do you know if there are some performance implications with the star selector? I remember that some years ago, for example, if you have a super big DOM, then you will be matching maybe thousands of elements. So do you know if that's better, if it is still a problem?
With matching additional elements?
Yes, if you have a super complex application and you use a star selector, then you will be matching the whole application. I think that at least is not the best practice.
No, it's not at all. And that's why I say it's typically only used for certain resets.
Yes.
But it's not common that we use this universal selector to apply styles to, you know, the entire DOM or the entire web application, because it's going to target pretty much everything, every element, regardless of its type, state, so on, so forth.
Yeah, also, we use it when we want to debug something like the box. Well, it used to be something that we do with the outline in red and just trying to see the boxes of all the elements we have in the page. So in order to see what's maybe overflowing our website or something like that. Also, it's very useful for that universal selector, in my opinion, my personal experience.
Yeah, and we can use it in multiple different ways. Use it with a space combinator to join it with ULs, unordered lists, or just about anything. Or we can have it, you know, if we have a color red here, we're searching for all unordered lists or all paragraphs or all, you know, there's many different ways that we can manipulate it. Yeah, we do that as well. Okay. But for, let's say, for example, we have our type selectors. Say, for example, we wanted to target this H1 here. We could do that, something like this here. Let's give it also color red. We're going to see we have a problem here. You know, if there are multiple H1s inside of our website, and we only wanted to target this one H1, then this obviously wouldn't be the ideal route to take, because it's not necessarily specific and it's going to apply to every single H1 that inherits from the style sheet. Okay, but I mean, that is an option, and there are different ways that we can lump these things together to achieve the results that we're looking for. But typically, we don't want to just apply a style to a simple element type or an element tag, like so. But it is a way that we can select elements on the page. Once again, this is something else that we could use for like CSS resets. So if we wanted to standardize a particular style for all of the H1s inside of our website, then maybe we do something like this, but you typically only see that in CSS resets. If I came in here and I had to apply a style to this header, applying a CSS rule like this would not necessarily be the route. We want to make sure that we make that as specific as possible so that it doesn't interfere with other code throughout our website. Okay, and we can also, you know, target our paragraph. We can give it the same ordeal. In this type of situation, if I wanted to particularly target this H1, a better option would be maybe to use its class. Okay, so we have class selectors. So instead of defining this as an H1, I define it as a class selector, and I can target this H1 and this H1 alone by its class. Now classes can be reused and not necessarily intended to be unique. So if I needed to apply that elsewhere, you know, we could apply that class in multiple places. But we do have IDs also that we can target these elements by. For example, we have the ID here on this main container. With our CSS classes and our HTML classes, we can reuse those, but for our IDs, we don't want to reuse those. Now we could reuse this ID and it probably wouldn't break here in Chrome, but there are some other browsers where it probably will start yelling at you and throwing different errors because using multiple IDs with the same name is technically illegal. But we can target our elements by their ID names also. Now these are just our simple selectors, targeting our elements by their tag name, targeting our elements by their class name, targeting our elements by their ID name, and also targeting them using the universal selector. So I'm sure most of us are familiar with targeting our CSS in this form or fashion. Okay. Now, that takes us to grouping. And say, for example, we wanted our H1 have a color of red. And we also wanted our paragraph to have a color of red. In this scenario, probably be best if we had joined these together. There's a principle in programming that we live by, and that's don't repeat yourself. And we have this repetition here, which we can prevent by joining these together. And the way that I can join selectors together is by separating them by a comma. So I can add the H1 and I can also add the paragraph together within the same style rule so that they can inherit from the same style by simply separating them by a comma. And I can add as many different elements as I like to. Okay? And we can continue to string elements in here for however many elements we like to. But one of the biggest reasons that we use grouping and we group all these selectors together is to prevent redundancy. If a code or a CSS rule could be reused somewhere, it's probably better that we reuse it as opposed to continuing to repeat ourselves and redefining all of these additional styles. It makes our work a lot faster and it makes our work a lot easier. You don't want to have to go tracking around in different styles if it's unnecessary, because sometimes it can get pretty difficult to determine where certain styles are being inherited from. Okay, and we'll do a little bit more of this. Well, this takes us to our combinators. There are times when we need to be more specific about which elements that we like to target, and this brings us to combinators and attribute selectors. Okay, what we were doing here was pretty simple, not really specific. We get more specific when we start getting into our defining our selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors. But using CSS selectors, you can get a lot more deep than that. But notice here inside of our combinators, we have Descendant Selector, we have Child Selectors, we have Adjacent Sibling Selector. Most of these are being titled similar to a family structure. And if you look at our code, you know, we have, for instance, this li is nested inside of this ul, which would make this list item here a child of this unordered list. So what these selectors do is they allow us to select different elements according to their position in their family structure. So the Descendant Selector, for example, with a space here, let's say I wanted to select the list items inside of this unordered list, but I didn't want to necessarily select every single list item that's inheriting from the style sheet. What I could do here is I could define, my UL, the class name of detail list, and then from there add in a space and li. And what that does is that's going to search for every single UL that's wrapped inside of every single li list item, that's wrapped inside of a UL with the class name of detail list. Okay, so that's going to select every single li in here. If I gave it a border, see that we've targeted these ULs here. Now if I created another list, I didn't necessarily have that class name, you see that one's going to be ignored. Okay, because it's particularly looking for list items that are a child of or contained within an unordered list with the class name of detail list. And with these tags here, we can continue to chain these things together. So we have an unordered list. If it has a class, without adding a space in between, we can then define its class, making that a little bit more specific. You know, if it had a ID, we could also chain that ID along to the end of there. For this li, if I wanted to target one in particular, for example, first li, you see it'll let me target the li that has the class name of first li. There are many, many more things that we could do there, but just to demonstrate combinators, combining tags, and combining tags with according to their tag name, their class name, their IDs, and so on and so forth. It's all about just making our CSS rule more specific.
And you can keep adding items to that chain. So if you keep adding spaces,
yes.
So you can target maybe a span inside that li and all that.
Yep. And we could also use a universal selector here, and it would target span. It will target also that li and anything else that we decide to throw inside of there. Okay. So just remember here with the space, what this is doing, what this is saying is select everything that's nested inside of the UL with the class name detail list. Here, select the LIs that are nested inside of a UL with a detailed list. We also have child selectors. The selector here in particular is not going to select everything like our universal selector did. It's only going to select direct children of an element. So what that means is, look here at this UL, the direct child of this element would be these LIs. But it wouldn't be the span necessarily, because the span is a child of the LI itself, not a direct child of this UL. So I could achieve the same result that I have here by adding this child selector. And we don't see any change here at all. Have a better example.
I think you can have an example using the universal selector, because if you just do the asterisk there, it will select the li and the span. But if you do that, you see that it selects only the next level.
Yes.
So I think that's clearer.
So it's selecting only the children, the direct children.
Yeah. It goes one level deep.
That's right. Okay, and we also have our adjacent sibling selector. What this is going to do is, I have to notice the word sibling here. Remember that these are all structured according to like a family structure. So the child selector is going to select the immediate children. Sibling selector is going to select the brother and the sister, or the sibling. So the adjacent sibling selector will select the brother or sister or the sibling that's directly next to an element. So, for example, if I have this H1, where we have one, and I wanted to select only this paragraph here, but I didn't want to necessarily target this one down here or any other inside of our DOM. I could define specifically this paragraph because it's the direct adjacent sibling, which means it's the brother or sister that's sitting directly next to it. And we do that by adding a plus and the element that we like to target.
You are missing a G. Yes.
And there we go. What that's doing is just selecting that one paragraph. If I added another paragraph here, you'll see that that's completely ignored. Okay? Because this particular combinator is only going to select the element that's directly next to it. Okay? Could use the
also
asterisk.
keep adding more. For example, if you add another plus sign, plus P, you will target the next one. Plus P. Yes. That should work. That's weird. Okay. That should work.
There it is. It was highlighted.
Okay. Basically, you can go one by one on the DOM on the same level using this selector. It's pretty amazing, in my opinion.
We can go to the sibling level as well.
Yep.
And so on and so forth, as deep as we need to.
It's super useful for dynamic information. For example, I use it a lot. If I have, for example, a lot of paragraph with a, I don't know, dividers, and at the end, if I have a button, then I don't want the divider, then you can use this adjustment selector. So you target, if there is a button after the last paragraph, then don't use the divider, for example.
Yeah. And that's an easy way to make sure that our styles don't conflict with other styles.
Yeah.
Just an extra barrier all there. Next, we have the general sibling selector. This one is also sibling selector, so it's only going to select siblings. It's not going to select children or descendants like the space did, but it's not going to necessarily select a sibling that's directly adjacent to it or directly next to it. It doesn't matter how far this sibling is for this one, it'll find it. So let's say, for instance, we have this image. And I wanted to get I wanted to select just like this unordered list here is one of its siblings. I can select a sibling no matter how far down the list or no matter how far down the row it might be. So with the adjacent selector, it was only selecting elements that are directly next to it. This one here, it doesn't matter how far it is down the list or how far it is down the row here, it'll select it. But if it is a child, let's say, for instance, I'm going to screw up and down here and add another UL inside of here. This UL isn't technically a sibling. It'll be completely ignored.
You need to close the last UL tag. Yes.
Yeah. So here, we're just targeting all siblings of the image that are ULs. This UL here isn't technically a sibling. It's a child of this div. The div would be a sibling of the image, but not the UL. This UL here would be its sibling. This would be its sibling. They're all on the same level. So I could target pretty much any of these siblings here. But if I apply the adjacent sibling selector, there is no UL directly next to this image. So that wouldn't work. If I needed to go further down the road, a little squiggly line. There we go. And we have the column selector also. This is one that Mariana brought to my attention. And pretty much what it does, I've never used it, never really seen it used, but it allows us to select pretty much elements that are nested within a table's column. So if I needed to grab a particular element according to a particular column inside of a table, I could use this column selector. It would be something like so, and it will only select paragraphs that are contained within inside of a column.
I saw it in MDN in the web page. Then I discovered that it doesn't have almost non-support for this. It's super experimental, so I don't think it's a nice idea to use it. But it was nice to see that it is there, something new. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that goes for a lot of, as we continue to move on, we're going to get into our pseudo selectors and whatnot. And there are a bunch of other pseudo selectors and selectors that we might not go into. And there are also a bunch of new ones that aren't fully supported as well. So as time goes on, we'll have more selectors coming from all over the place that we can use. But I think MDN is probably a really good resource if you guys wanted to look into and research a little bit more of all these different selectors to see all the differences, the things that are available to us and the things that are coming along to us in the pipeline. Okay.
I have a question about these kind of selectors. Like, do you normally use them, or you try to go for classes and more specific selectors? It's not only about performance, but this idea of using the structure of the HTML for selecting. Where are practical examples where you use these kind of selectors?
I hear you. The space combinator is obviously used all over the place. But we also use a child selector. We also use the adjacent sibling selector quite often. And it's just to make sure that our code is very specific. If I wanted to be sure that I'm only targeting a particular element so that it didn't affect anything else on the application, I might use these. But these are also very helpful for when August was showing a few weeks ago CSS interactivity without JavaScript. These are used to really pinpoint, really finely pinpoint different elements that we need to interact with. So there's an example that I'll try to get into where I'll create a notification with a tooltip on here, and we'll see how we use some of these different selectors, maybe the child selector and adjacent sibling selector, along with a few of our pseudo selectors all together to, perform different pretty cool tasks. But I do use these pretty often. But for the most part, it's just to make sure that my code is very, very specific. We don't really want our CSS to be vague, because then we risk destroying other parts or implementing bugs in other parts of our application. And that's where things like this will come in handy.
Yeah, or sometimes you know that it's going to be an element for example, when you have a dynamic page and you have content that you don't know what it's going to be, if it's going to be a paragraph or a heading or a span or whatever. So you can target those elements with any of these attachments, maybe with I'm not sure if I'm saying something, but I have an example I can show after. But sometimes that you want to, that something that go after this, you want to have that a specific class, and could be whatever. So
that's right.
It's a little bit like, yes, more open.
Specific.
Yeah.
And that takes us to attribute selectors, and these are similar situation where we need to make sure that we're being really specific about our selections. We can also use attribute selectors. So attribute selectors allow us to target an element based on the presence of an attribute and or the value of an attribute. So if you look here in this list, we have a name attribute. Pretty much this will define an attribute. Not all attributes have a value. So this attribute here will allow us to select an element with a particular attribute name and also attributes that might not contain a value. We could get more specific with our attributes. We could name the name of the attribute right along with the value that we expect it to have. White space separated. This is, as we get over into these, I think it'll probably be better to go and do some demonstration here. If you look at this image, for example, this image has a source attribute and it also has an alt attribute. Now we can target this image not just by its tag name, or if we gave it a class or we gave it an ID. We could also tag attach to this image here by selecting its source attribute or its alt attribute. So instead of just image here, I remove this, it'll get huge. I can select every element that has an alt attribute. Okay, so if there are multiple images, most all images should have an alt attribute. This selector here will select every image on the page with an alt attribute. But if I wanted to be more specific, I could also define the value that I'm expecting. Doing something like this here will make sure that this image is the only image that's selected with this particular selector, unless there are other images that share this exact same name. Okay. Now this here is case sensitive. So if I were to make that lowercase c, it will no longer work. But if you look here, we also have modifiers now. Some of these modifiers aren't necessarily supported. I believe S has been supported for a long time, because by default, these attribute selectors are case sensitive, which is what the S stands for. But the I is a little bit more new. It's supported in Chrome. It might be supported in Firefox, but then it gets real sketchy after that. Hopefully that changes in the future. But if we wanted this to be case insensitive, all we have to do is add I at the end of our attribute. And we'll see that now it ignores the case sensitivity here. So it's pretty nifty.
That's weird. That's pretty weird, actually.
Yeah, and I don't really see a need for the S, because by default it's case sensitive. But the I could see that coming in handy.
Yep. I use this a lot with data elements. So for example, on layouted, we have a data column and data row. Mm-hmm. And then you can target, for example, the first column on the first row by using a combination of both attributes. And also you can put class instead of alt. And you can actually, since the class is an attribute, you can use it as a selector. It's also pretty weird. You have an extra C. Yes, that works, right?
Yep, sure does. I mean, our image overflows, but yeah, our container.
I mean, it doesn't make sense to use it like this, but I think it's a good example that you can target pretty much any attribute that you have on your element.
That's right. And that's primarily what I want to demonstrate here, is all the different ways and all the different selectors that we can use to target our elements. You know, there's so many different ways that we can target our elements, and when we learn those things, it really opens us up to being able to do some pretty cool stuff. So now there are other characters, additional characters that we can add to our attribute selectors to more define what we're searching for. For example, this one here, if we add it, I don't know what this character is called. It's the squiggly line. If we add that in there, it'll only search for a value that's separated by a space. For this one, if we add the up caret, it'll only search for an attribute that starts with whatever value we define. If we add the $, it will only look for attributes with a value that ends with the value that we define. So, for example, white space. So if we only want to define, for example, CSS3, but it has to be separated inside of our alt attribute by a white space, we do that. But if we remove the white space out of there, it no longer works. Or if that's by itself, it's still not separated by a white space. No, well, I guess that does work, but it shouldn't. But this one is primarily for finding individual words. They're all separated by spaces. This one we could also search for an alt that has the word, the value of logo inside of it. So it doesn't care if it's at the end, it doesn't care if it's at the beginning, whatever. It should only care about whether it's separated by space or not. But I think in this situation, it shows us that even if it's the only word here, it seems to work also.
And you can actually use it with the class as well. So if you use class and then these characters, then you will match the classes that start with that. So I think it's pretty interesting how you can do super specific selectors using this.
It really is. It really is.
Maybe you want to match every button with a class that starts with BTN, for example, something like that.
That's super useful, yes.
Yep.
Also with the universal selector, isn't it, that the class and the, I can copy something on the, it's hard to explain the characters in English. I can copy that on the channel.
Okay.
But yeah, you have like the class and universal selector, and then equal to the class name that you want to match, and all the classes that start with that name will inherit the rules that we are describing. I copied that on the channel, sorry.
This is the prefix selector, or the prefix,
the universal selector, like the asterisk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so every class that starts with detail will match, I guess.
And I think that will find any string of characters, no matter where it is. So we probably could even do it like this here. Yeah, and it still applies the same way. So it's like our wildcard.
Yeah.
We can find any string of characters, and classes and IDs are also attributes. So it should work with those also.
It's like using a regex to match classes, something like that.
Exactly. We have our prefix. That's pretty much just going to look for a value that starts with whatever value we define inside of here. So this class starts with detail, and that's what it's going to match to. You still see our container has a height of 50 pixels. But if I change this to contain, it should break it. But since contain is the suffix of the value here, if I change that caret to the $, it should select it again, because this is selecting a value from class that ends with contain. And we could do the same with, once again, with any attribute on any of our HTML elements. So this would also work with the logo for our alt, making our logo 50 pixels in height, but it wouldn't work for CSS3. I could change this to prefix. We'll find CSS3 because our alt attribute is prefixed, or the value of our alt attribute, I'm sorry, is prefixed with CSS3. So there's just a bunch of different ways that you could target our HTML elements using also their attributes. So we've gone over targeting by the tag name, class names, their IDs, the universal selectors, combinators, selecting them by their attributes, by their position in relation to one another. And we'll continue to move on here. Yes, and here is the, I don't know if they call this the universal modifier. Oh, this is what Mariana had mentioned.
Yes, sorry, I took it. I spoiled everything, sorry.
No, that's all right. It's okay. I think it's good for demonstration. But yeah, this will allow us to select an attribute based on the value, and it doesn't matter where that value comes up at. You'll find it anywhere inside of that attribute's value. Now we enter the mystery schools. Pseudo selectors. So there are two different categories of pseudo selectors. Now these type of selectors here are not like our typical selectors. When we went over attribute selectors, we were selecting elements based on their attribute. These we were selecting them based on their position. I think another thing to note here is we can search for elements going down the tree. For instance, we can find children, we can find siblings that are directly next to each other, but we can't use any of these, and there are no combinators that I'm aware of that we can use to go up the tree. So, for example,
not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
If we had this H1 and we wanted to select the sibling here that's above it, there is no option yet to make that happen. But we can go down the tree as far as we want to, as long as it's within our scope. It doesn't cause us to have to backtrack, go backwards. Okay. Grouping, but we went over our single selectors. All of these selectors that we went over already pretty much are selecting an element by some sort of attribute or its name. Pseudo selectors are different. We have pseudo classes and we have pseudo elements. What pseudo classes allow us to do is they allow us to style our elements based on an element's state. And also its position in the DOM, similar to like a family structure as well, but slightly different from what we did here in our combinators. And we also have pseudo elements, and pseudo elements are keywords that can be added to a selector to style an individual part of a selected element or elements. So for example, if we have a heading and we wanted to target the first letter in that heading, we can use pseudo elements to target the first letter. If we wanted to target the first line or the first row in a paragraph, we can use a pseudo element to target the first row, so on and so forth. Pseudo classes, each element has its own set of state values. So for instance, when we are hovering over a button and the color changes, okay, we're able to do that by taking advantage of the pseudo classes, okay. So pseudo classes are used to style an element based on its state and or its position. And maybe I should have added here also its history, because if you look here, we have visited. Let's see if we can. We have this anchor tag inside of this paragraph. Now, right now we see the color is purple. I believe I might have clicked on that anchor tag before. But an anchor tag has a pseudo class called visited, so that once that tag is clicked on, or once that anchor element is clicked on, when you return back to here, the browser should remember that that's been clicked on, and we can apply specific styles according to whether it's been clicked or whether it hasn't. I think we'll save that one. But we also have hover. We can style an element according to its hover state. So we have hover, we have focus, and we also have active. Now let's say, for instance, here inside of this UL, we wanted to change the color of the text whenever they're hovered over. You can do that by doing something like this. So we're looking for every li that's nested inside of a UL, and for a pseudo class, we want to put a colon character, and then we can define that state. And what this is going to do is it's going to look out for that li's hover state to become true. And hover state becomes true. Let's say I want to make the color green. You see when we hover over these elements, they change color. Because now we're not only just selecting an element by its name or by its attribute or whatnot, we are targeting this element according to its state. So let's get this element and let's wait for its hover state to become true. When its hover state becomes true, we can change its color to green. We can do all sorts of things with hover. If you look here inside of this form, these elements, they have what's called a focus state. Okay, not all elements necessarily have a focus state right out of the box, but these do. So a lot of times we'll see inside of a lot of the forms, when we click on a form, the border around the outside will glow, or it'll change colors, or a shadow will appear, or something of that nature. So if we wanted to target this input according to whenever it was focused on, we could do something like, let's get the input with the attribute type of text. So we'll single out the first one here, add our colon character for our pseudo class, and we'll define when it's focused. Okay, and when it's focused, let's say we want to add a box shadow. And then make it blue or something. What should happen here, as soon as we click on there, focus state becomes true for this element, and the styles that we applied using that pseudo class should now apply to this element. And we can do that with just about any elements. And I can make this a little less specific. Now it'll apply to every input. Now we also have a pseudo class of checked. I believe this is what Agus was working with when he did the modal. And what that does is that gives us access to the checkbox state. So when the checkbox is checked, we can target the checkbox based on that particular state, and we can perform all sorts of other actions. Now these here aren't necessarily selecting an element by its state. What these are doing is it's selecting an element by its position. So nth of type, for example, let's say inside of this UL, we want it to target the first li. Now there's many ways that we can do this, but I just want to show you all how, you know, the wealth of different ways that we can perform all these different actions that we need. But if we needed to have the first li, something similar to this here, and pretty much what this is a function. There's a CSS function and it should look for the first of the type li. If I change this to 2, it would look for the second of the type li. Change that to 3, it would look for the third, and so on and so forth. Let's say I wanted the first. I'm going to give it a solid border, solid red border. We'll target the first. And as I move this, we'll just continue to do this thing. Notice here, it does the same exact thing. Because the way this works is it's not only finding the first of that type, it's finding the first of that type within its scope. So this is the first li, right now it's the third li within the scope of that and within the scope of that UL. And the same with this one here. It's the third li within the scope of that UL. Remove that. Put them all together. And see, it would ignore those. And it sticks with the third there. We also have last of type. So we could go from the back. Last of type.
I think that's a good alternative to last child, because if you use last child here and the element is not the last child, it won't work. It's a bit like confusing, in my opinion. If you say last child of some class, it doesn't work unless it's the final element on that parent. I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly, but I think this last of type is the most like common sense option.
And I agree. We also have first of type. So all these are just ways that we can select and target different elements according to their position, according to their type, according to their position in their child structure, with their other siblings. We have in child, and pretty much does something similar, but they're slightly different. We grab the second child, which will look for the second li within its parent. Okay. Some other cool things we can do here. We can target all odd children. Put an odd inside of there. We can target all even children. This is something that I commonly do on tables. We have tables and we have table rows, and we want them to have like stripes inside of them, or go from white to gray to white to gray to white to gray. The easiest way is to use something like this for the table rows, and we'll get all even table rows, all even children within a table row. We can apply whatever style we want to, give it a gray background, or however we'd like to do it. So that's pretty cool there. There are lots of other ones. You can do a search on the internet or on MDN. You can pull those all up. But these are just some of the most common. We rarely ever use a lot of the other ones, but checked, hover, focus, active, visited, last of type, first of type, nth child. These you'll see commonly used. We use these quite often. And what these do, once again, is it just makes it easier for you to be more specific as to what you're trying to define. Now, we can define and we can grab all even or all odd children in other ways. This isn't the only way that we can do it, but this is probably fastest, the easiest, the most clean, the most intuitive way of making that happen, of selecting each odd, even, or first, or second, or last child, or whatever we need to get done there. Now we have pseudo elements. Pseudo elements are a little different. They're keywords that can be added to a selector to style an individual part of a selected element or element. We can also add pseudo selectors and pseudo elements together to create some pretty cool features. For example, if you see we have the pseudo element first letter here. Let's say we wanted to, well, let me get rid of this here. Okay. So on hover, if I wanted to make the first letter of each one of these LIs, for example, I mean, probably nothing we do in the real world there, but just for demonstration purposes, if I wanted to make the first letter of this LI here enlarged on hover, I could do that by lumping together the pseudo class right along with my pseudo element. So I'll find all LIs that are children of ULs. When the hover state is true, I'm going to use a pseudo element to grab the first letter. Let's increase its size to maybe 24 pixels and the color red. What this is going to do is it's just going to target the first letter. So you see when we hover over this now, only the first letter is being enlarged, and it's also happening on hover. So that's our pseudo elements interacting and working together. And that's when things get really cool, is when we start lumping these things together. You know, we lump our combinators together with our pseudo elements and our pseudo classes, and we can really come up with some pretty cool stuff. You know, modals, tooltips, and so on and so forth. This paragraph here. I can target the first line.
You're missing a double column.
Thank you. I think that brings up a good point as well. If you notice the difference here between pseudo classes and pseudo elements, pseudo classes we define with 1 colon, and pseudo elements we define with 2 colons. There was a time when there wasn't this distinction. You know, some of the old Internet Explorer, for example, we have pseudo elements like before and after, and those will work with 1 or 2 colons. And they'll still work just for backwards compatibility's sake. But there came a time when there needed to be a distinction, because obviously these two are achieving different results. They're doing 2 different things. So the way that they came up to differentiate between the two in the code is to define pseudo classes with 1 colon and define pseudo elements with 2 colons. Now there are some pseudo elements that are not backwards compatible because you know, they just weren't out back then. If you tried to use 1 colon, it wouldn't work. And you'd be struggling trying to figure out exactly what's going on here. So it's good to just make sure that we keep that convention for pseudo elements, and we use 2 colons. For pseudo classes, we use 1 colon. For pseudo elements, not only can we select parts of an element, we can select pieces of an element, different regions of a particular element. We can also take particular regions of an element and insert things into the DOM. And I think that's kind of the best representation of where the word pseudo comes from in the first place. Pseudo is like something that's not there. Okay, so with before and after, we're pretty much taking an area of the DOM that had nothing there, and we can use these to insert things. We can use them to insert icons, words, text. August was mentioning the data attribute. I think these are great for responsive tables when we need to break a table up and display it differently for mobile devices. Inside of there, I can pull the data attribute, you know, and I can pretty much put it and place it wherever I need to put it and place it to make my table collapsible. Okay. Now there are a bunch more pseudo elements. But once again, not all of them are supported yet. There are a lot of new things that are coming that are still being worked on that are experimental, but these are some of the most common, especially after and before. You use these all the time, almost a day-to-day basis. So there's something to really get familiar with in CSS. But there's this one demonstration here that I'd like to kind of put together, and it'll show a lot of this stuff and lumping all of these different selectors and pseudo selectors and combinators and all that stuff together. And what it is pretty much a simple notification, but I like to create this notification also with a tooltip inside of it. I'm going to put this here at the top. I have some styling here just for the sake of time. And all I'm defining is a div. This is going to contain our notification. It has a notification, text, our copy. And it'll also have some wording saying hover for more information. And when you hover, this span should populate. At the moment, everything's there, but let's add a little bit of styling to it. So,
James, how are you?
hello, I'm good. How about yourself?
A little bit late. Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you made it.
Yeah.
You misses all the fun.
Okay, so pretty much what this block here is that I added is it's going to add a little bit of style to it, give it a border, give it a thicker border over here. This information right here, we're going to hide because we only want that to show up as a tooltip when we hover over this button here. Also, we're going to insert, using before, we're going to insert a little exclamation mark over here. We're going to do that using this before. Now, I don't like that color. Maybe it's my screen. Does that color look terrible to you all? That gold?
Could be worse.
Yes.
Okay, that looks a little better.
Yes, better.
Okay. But what you can see here is this exclamation mark isn't defined anywhere inside of here. Okay. What we did here was targeted the notification 1 by its class selector. We used the pseudo element before. What this is going to do is inside of content, this is where we define our exclamation mark, and it's going to insert what we define here inside of content right before all of the other content. Okay. But instead of defining it right before the other content, we set this as position absolute. That pulls it out of the flow of things, and then I can position it where I want to position it. So I can change its position by changing its left and top values. I don't think the top value really needs to be adjusted there. It looks good. Now for the tooltip. Just add a little bit of styling to there. Change the cursor up a little bit. And the tooltip text. I'm going to add this and then we'll talk about it. Now we see that's been hidden. Now this is all being done using CSS. There's no JavaScript here, it's all CSS selectors. This text that's here inside of this tooltip, this text here is defined inside of the span with the class tooltip text. If you look here, we have that text hidden. So we select using the selector the tooltip text by its class. We hide it, change its position according to where we wanted to place it to, top, so on and so forth. And we set its opacity to 0. Set its opacity to 0 so that we can add a transition. But notice here, what we have going on is for the tooltip itself, which is the text here. When this tooltip has a hover state of true, we're going to use the child selector. We're going to look for one of its children with the class name tooltip text. Okay, so whenever we hover over tooltip, it's going to grab tooltip text. It's going to turn it visible. It's going to up its opacity. It's going to add a simple transition, 0.6, make that 0.5. And that's pretty much how that works. It's not anything too advanced, but it does kind of prove the power of, you know, learning to get used to the CSS selectors. The CSS selectors can be very, very powerful, can do some really cool things. I believe when August was showing the modal, there was a label that's attached to a checkbox. You set selectors to watch the checkbox for a state of checked. When that state is checked, you then have maybe a div or a container sitting right next to it that's hidden or has display none. When we detect that it's checked, we change its CSS from display none to display block. You know, and a lot of other fancy stuff, add a backdrop and so on and so forth, but it simply is just the power of CSS selectors. And a lot of times, you know, we think that this stuff needs to be done in JavaScript, and it's not necessarily the case. Just understanding CSS selectors can achieve a lot of this for us. And I'm not too sure, you know, the information behind it, but I believe, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, using CSS for a lot of this interactivity is better for performance as well. Better for performance than using JavaScript. Because if I'm not mistaken, we're using JavaScript, we're using up browser memory, we're using up browser processing, and CSS is kind of a different beast.
I think it's faster but less reliable in a way. I mean, JavaScript is a good way of maybe patching all the issues that CSS has. So it's kind of both worlds, something like that.
Well, we see here with these selectors, we can do some pretty cool things. There's lots of other things we could do for the sake of time. I think that's pretty cool. Add this exclamation mark using by targeting this element and using its pseudo element to add that in there. This is targeted using a hover state. When it's hovered, we choose to show or hide one of its children. And that's all that's going on here. Okay, and I think that's about it. But one thing I wanted to touch on, you know, before we finish here is specificity. When there are multiple style rules being applied to the same element, CSS uses specificity to determine which rules to apply and which to ignore. This is one of the most common issues that I see, especially with those who are new to CSS, is we'll apply a style to a particular element and nothing happens. And we're wondering why I applied this style, but it's not changing. It's not doing, you know, what I wanted it to do. In most cases, it comes down to specificity. Specificity can be a little complicated to understand at first, but pretty much all CSS is saying is that the more specific your style is, the more precedence it has. If your style is not specific and there's another style that's targeting the exact same element that is more specific, then the more specific style is going to take precedence over the less specific style. So a lot of times the less specific style is ignored. And if we look inside of our browser tools, our developer tools, we can look down the list and we can figure out exactly which rules and which styles are taking precedence over our styles. And 9 times out of 10 is because of specificity, because our styles are not as specific. Worst case scenario, they're being overridden by an important statement. Okay. I'm not going to try to get too deep into this here, but here in this list, these are selectors listed from least to greatest in terms of specificity. And what that's saying is when we define type selectors, for example, this H1 here, this is pretty much holding the smallest amount of weight in terms of specificity. This H1 has a class. So if you look at the list here, type selectors are at the bottom. Then we have classes, attribute selectors, pseudo selectors. Then we have ID selectors, and we have inline styles. It's pretty much saying from the bottom here, these are the weakest in terms of specificity. And as we get down to the bottom, they get stronger. So classes hold a higher weight than type selectors, attribute selectors, pseudo selectors. They're all on the same level as class selectors. ID selectors hold a heavier weight than class selectors, and inline styles hold a heavier weight than all of those. Okay, and I can demonstrate that here. It's H1. Currently, it has a color of red, but if I define another class here, or if I define another rule, and try to apply a different style, and let's say we want to turn that green, it'll work. And this style here will be ignored, completely ignored, because the class holds a heavier specificity weight than the H1, but it also has an ID. Now, if we do the same thing here, we try to give it a color of purple, that's going to take precedence over the H1, no matter where it is. It could be above it, it could be below it, it's still heavier, technically, according to CSS, than those two are. But if I went in here, I gave it an inline style, color red. See, now the inline style takes precedence over all of this that I've defined. Okay, because inline styles pretty much are at the top of the specificity chart when it comes to CSS. So anytime we define an inline style, it makes it difficult for us to manage these styles when it comes to trying to style them inside of our CSS style sheet. And the only way that we can override this inline style would be by using an important clause. Now, mind you, using important and inline styles both are bad practice. It makes it very difficult for us to manage the style sheet, so it's best that we avoid these. But one of the only valid cases that I know of for the important style is if there are inline styles defined and there's no other way to override it. If you can't change that inline style or you don't have access to that particular component, that's the only time that I know maybe we could consider using an important clause. But even then, you should still be wary, because then we get to overriding importance with importance. And it can get very, 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 very messy. But opposed to doing that, if we need to override styles, instead of adding inline styles and important clauses, a simple understanding of specificity could get us the results that we're looking for. So say, for example, we have an H1 here. Every time I define more regarding this H1's position in the DOM tree, it's going to begin to hold more specificity. So that is more specific than what this would be. So if this style here was already defined inside of our CSS, and we didn't see that, and we didn't know that, and we come down here, and we wanted to change that heading one, and all we did was this. And let's say we wanted to make that purple. Nothing's happening. Why? Because there's another style targeting that exact same element that's a little bit more specific than this style is. And what makes it more specific is that it also defines its parent. Okay? And then we have the space combinator in between. So the defining of its parent makes that style more specific than this style. Okay, so a lot of times when we're adding styles and we're wondering, hey, what's going on? Majority of the time, the issue is there's another style trying to modify the same element that you're modifying, and its specificity weight is a little bit higher than what you have. One thing that, an easy way to get around this if you have access to these components is, remember that ID holds the highest weight. So if you're having problems there, you can just give this an ID demonstration heading. Color of gold. Oh, I have two different, it already has an ID. And what you'll see is it doesn't matter how specific these styles are, this ID, it's always going to hold a higher specificity weight than classes or tag names. The only thing that'll override that ID is an inline style. It's kind of best that we avoid inline styles so that we can maintain the code inside of the style sheet. And we can continue to, we can make these as specific as we want. But I think it's just important to know, I don't want to go entirely too deep, but it's just important to know that specificity counts. CSS will determine what styles to apply to which element according to what it deems to be more specific or what it deems to be heavier in the specificity way. Okay, and there are a bunch of different resources that are out there to help understand specificity, but just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, the universal selector and combinators hold no specificity weight. So, anything I define here with color purple, so on and so forth, will always override what I put inside of the universal selector. Okay. Now, these things that don't have any kind of definition, they don't have any style definitions, they're going to take on the color of that universal selector. But anything that does have any kind of definition, even if it's just a tag, they will always overrule the universal selector because the universal selector has no specificity weight whatsoever. Inline styles override all selectors. The only rule that will override an inline style is an important rule, and inline styles and important rules are bad practice. So keep that in mind if we're applying styles and nothing's happening. Might want to take a look at our specificity. I believe that should be about it. Any questions?
We need applauses, actually. That was amazing, James. Thanks a lot.
Super in depth.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any questions? I think you covered like everything, so I don't know if there will be a lot of questions.
Yeah,
there is also some people that already left the call because they had stand-ups on daily, but they sent me DMs to tell you thanks a lot for the talk because they thought it was really good.
Yes. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity. Much thanks to you, August, and Mariana as well. Very thankful for you all. You all taught me a lot. Really appreciative for the opportunity and to be here with you all.
Thanks so much, James. So do we have any question for James?
It was very clear.
That's not a question. It's amazing.
Yeah, if we have more,
I think we are going to promote a lot the talk. Like I will like make the recording available, and then we're going to promote it because it's really complete.
Yeah, and this was pretty broad. You know, we touched on a lot of different things. So for the sake of time, you know, couldn't get into too many detailed examples of things like that, but hopefully one day.
We can have more workshops. It's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thanks everybody, and again, thanks a lot, James. Like you put a lot of work on the presentation and everything. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
See you, everybody.
Thanks.
See you.
See you. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thanks.
James.
Bye bye.